How does a non-Christian go about converting to Christianity? How about changing Christian membership from one church to another?
Prospective converts to Christianity generally begin with a period of instruction in the essentials of Christian doctrine. In some communities, a sponsor presents the interested party to the appropriate representatives of the church and accompanies the candidate through the process of preparation. Instruction can occur either individually or in groups. In some cases, the teacher is a lay specialist in religious education, while in others a priest, minister, or deacon assumes that role. Some churches coordinate the formal reception of converts with the liturgical cycle, so that members are officially received into full communion on a special occasion, such as the Holy Saturday Easter Vigil service. Baptism is the primary rite by which new members are incorporated into their chosen communities. When the individual is converting from a non-Christian tradition, baptism is invariably conferred.
Are there any sub-communities or denominations within Shinto?
Numerous varieties and schools of Shinto have come and gone over the past 1300 years. Here briefly are a few of the more important: an ascetical mountain sect called Shugendo began as early as the Nara period, 710 to 794, and small groups remain active today. Beginning during the Middle Ages, several schools have arisen under the patronage of important members of powerful clans, now identified by the names of those families or of the school's individual founders. The larger groups are Urabe, also known by the later family name of Yoshida, and Uietsu-Unification Shinto, Watarai, also called Ise Shinto, the Confucian-oriented school of Yoshikawa, and Kurozumaikyo, named after its 19th-century founder. Several other schools are identified by terms that suggest their principal teaching or emphases. For example, a 17th-century school called Suga, bestowal of blessings. Shinto laid groundwork for the growth of national learning. Suno Ichijutsu blended Shinto themes with esoteric teachings of Tendai Buddhism in the 17th century, focusing on the divine manifestation of a mountain king. Finally, Minkan Shinko is a general designation for a host of developments called folk religious beliefs and practices, incorporating elements of Shinto as well as other traditions. Japanese governments have promulgated various types of legislation, especially since the late 19th century, aimed at keeping track of the many religious groups that have occasionally leveled severe criticism at the imperial form of governance.
Do Daists and practitioners of CCT believe in angels?
Spirits of all kinds inhabit the ordinary world of countless adherents of Daoism and CCT. but none quite fit the precise description most readers would identify as angelic. Angels are generally understood as pure immortal spirits made that way from the start. Chinese deist and popular beliefs include countless immortal beings, but apart from the highest gods, most of those began as human beings and achieved immortality later. In addition, angels in other traditions typically function as messengers or guardians. A variety of spirits play those roles in deist and CCT lore. Perhaps the closest thing to angels in the Chinese repertoire of religious symbolism are the apsaras imported into China with Buddhism.
Latin became the sacred language of most of what is the Lord's Prayer.
The Lord's Prayer, or the Our Father, is found in the Gospels of Matthew, 6:9-13, and Luke, 11:2-4. Both Gospels position the Lord's Prayer as Jesus' response to his disciples' request to teach them how to pray. Based on linguistic studies, most biblical scholars today agree that this prayer likely came from Jesus' own lips, "Our Father, who art in heaven. Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen." Western Christendom until the Reformation, resulting in the use of Europe's vernaculars as standard practice of many Protestant churches. Greek continued as the language of the Byzantine Rite. But among the Eastern churches the equivalent of vernacular usage eventually became more common. Russian Orthodoxy and related churches preferred Old Slavonic as their sacred liturgical tongue. Today, vernacular languages dominate Christian liturgical practice. Some churches retain the ancient tongues for the most sacred part of the liturgy, namely the Eucharistic prayer, in which the sacred species, bread and wine, are consecrated. A few very small Roman Catholic churches have sought to revive the use of Latin for the entire Mass. Change to exclusive use of vernaculars in most communities has been designed to increase participation and intelligibility for the congregation. But some argue that this has emptied the sacred action of its sense of mystery.
What is a saint?
Individuals who embody to the highest degree a religious tradition's spiritual ideals function in a variety of ways. Some traditions, such as Sunni Islam and various Christian denominations, emphasize the importance of each individual's direct relationship with the Supreme Being. They teach that no human being has the power or authority to act as a mediator for anyone else. But the need for help in achieving the highest spiritual aspirations seems to run so deep that examples of saintly characters appear in the histories of virtually every religious tradition. The ability to perform miracles is a major feature in some traditions. Healing is perhaps the most common claim. But miracles can include everything from finding lost objects to raising the dead. Saints in some traditions become more powerful and active after death than during their lives. And devotees shower them with requests generation after generation. According to some traditions, such as Roman Catholicism, individuals reputed for their holiness in life must show their worthiness to be formally declared saints by having certified miracles attributed to them after death. Healings are the most common wonders needed to bring about the saint's canonization. Special cults, in the sense, not of exclusive religious organizations, but of people who cultivate a particular devotion, of certain saints have developed in some communities. Believers sometimes claim a particular holy person as their patron saint, associating him or her with a particular place and with specific types of miracles. But saints can also develop a more universal following and have devotees wherever members of a particular tradition are to be found.
What place does Muhammad occupy in Islamic tradition?
Muslims consider Muhammad the last in a line of prophets, commissioned to act as God's spokesman to humankind. Beginning with Adam and continuing down through Jesus. The pre-Islamic prophets preached the same fundamental message of belief in one sovereign transcendent God. But because successive generations invariably found the message difficult and inconvenient, people sometimes corrupted or diluted the revelation. Hence, God chose upright individuals to reassert the original revelation.
How did Hinduism become a religion of the masses?
For as long as several millennia, earlier forms of the greater Hinduism apparently limited direct involvement in religious ritual to a kind of religious elite. Full participation was open for many centuries only to the various ranks of priestly ritual specialists. Even after the climate began to change in the Upanishad period, religion remained the province of professionally religious types who wrote the Upanishads, as well as independent-minded seekers who founded the early ascetic and philosophical movements. With the growth of mythic religious texts, called the Puranas, came parallel developments in a type of devotional Vaishnava called Bhakti that no longer regarded the ultimate spiritual forces as fearsome and impersonal. Nor was spiritual realization reserved only for the few who had access to the lofty speculation of the Upanishads and the teachers. The Puranas talked of divine involvement in human affairs in ways that appealed to the imagination of ordinary people. 18 major Puranas, 6 dedicated to each of the 3 principal popular names and forms of God: Shiva, Vishnu, and the goddess or Shakti, opened up a world in which the humblest person could approach God and be assured of acceptance. Out of that broader movement have grown the many denominations and sects that comprise popular Hinduism today. Major sub-communities are named for the principal deities they worship. Devotees of Shiva are called Shaivas. Devotees of Vishnu, Vaishnavas, and devotees of the female deities, Shaktas.
What is the caste system?
India's ancient Hindu social system combines several complex elements. Perhaps best known are the four principal varnas or social classes. The term varna means color or appearance. As early as the Vedic period, the Brahmin or priestly class rose to the top of the social ladder. They were responsible for maintaining the integrity of ritual practice and traditional teaching. Nowadays Brahmins are by no means all connected with priestly activities as such. One rung below the Brahmins are the Kshatriyas, those who govern. Traditionally called the warrior or princely class. They have been the legislators as well as enforcers of the law. On the next lower rung are the more numerous merchants, financiers, agriculturalists, and industrialists who comprise the Vaishya class. As class designations, the terms Kshatriya and Vaishya are now obsolete. Most numerous of all are the Shudras, the laborers and craftspersons who perform the basic services. Varna distinctions generally cut across language, occupational and geographical barriers. In addition to the four varnas are the hundreds, perhaps even as many as 4,000, of jatis. Jati means birth or species and refers to the countless local social groups defined by occupation and language. As many as 25,000 additional groupings are called subcastes. Members of both jatis and subcastes generally associate themselves with one of the varnas. And many Indians still observe strict rules of purity and separation. Finally, between 1 and 200 million people are considered outcasts. Untouchables, or unscheduled classes, those who don't fit in the great system. Since India gained independence, the caste system has been officially illegal. But systems of such antiquity do not yield readily to legislation passed in capital cities.
What is the mandate of heaven?
Confucians have interpreted the concept of mandate or will of heaven in various ways over the centuries. As an ingredient in Confucian political thought, the concept has functioned both as a means of legitimation of the regime in power and a justification for overthrowing an unjust regime. The notion derives from a traditional Chinese belief in an elaborate network of correspondences among all levels of existence: the heavenly, the earthly, and the human. Human beings are not the independent source of authority. They can hope for harmony only through sensitivity to the ways of heaven above and of nature below. Order in society depends on the good faith effort of a single human being. The emperor as son of heaven, to rule unselfishly by always consulting the will of heaven. A theory of imminent retribution holds that there is a direct connection between natural and moral evil. In the world and heaven's displeasure with any emperor who arrogantly forgets the source of his authority. When the people prosper, one can conclude with certainty that affairs of state are in order. All as a direct result of the emperor's keeping his priorities straight. Many of the great Confucian thinkers have taught that the tradition's most consistent contribution to society has been that of fearlessly holding the ruler responsible to his people. If the one on the throne presides over an unjust regime, that person is no longer worthy of the name emperor. According to Meng Ziyi, for example, the people have the right to remove such a fraudulent leader. Meng Ziyi argued that violent overthrow of an unjust ruler was not regicide but tyrannicide. The greatest sovereign, therefore, is the one who governs only after first submitting to a higher authority.
What sorts of signs or symbols do Muslims use at home?
Many Muslim families decorate their homes with wall hangings and other small objects with religious significance. Popular items include cloth or paper panels showing beautifully written texts of the Quran. Pictures of Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, or of other important mosques or shrines are quite common. Some families prominently display a copy of the Quran, often kept in a special case or wrapping, on a bookstand or on the mantle. Shiite households frequently have pictures of Ali, his two sons Hassan and Hussein, and sometimes also of other imams or their burial places. Muslim households will not own or display a picture of Muhammad or any of the other prophets. Special times and seasons often call for special religious ornament. Some families put the Quran center stage during Ramadan, for example.
What were the most important early Islamic sectarian movements?
Immediately upon Muhammad's death, Muslims had to face the question of succession to leadership of the community. One faction claimed that the Prophet had designated his cousin and son-in-law, Ali, as his successor. They were to become known as the party or faction, Shia, of Ali. And today their various sub-communities are called Shi'i Muslims or Shiites. But a majority held that Muhammad had made no such appointment, and that it was up to the elders to choose from among themselves. They considered their course of action to be both in keeping with the example of Muhammad, called his Sunnah, and in the spirit of the needs of the whole community. Jama'ah, Jama'ah, of Muslims. This majority group came to be known as the people of the Sunnah and the Assembly. Al-As-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, or Sunni Muslims for short.
What are angels? Do they have a role in many traditions?
Angels and similar celestial beings appear in numerous traditions all over the world. The classic image of the angel, a winged ethereal body with human features, may have originated in the Middle East. The ancient prophetic tradition called Zoroastrianism had a highly developed cosmology, in which angel-like beings called Amishaspentas were attendants at the heavenly court of Ahura Mazda. Even in the early books of the Hebrew Bible we find mention of heavenly emissaries who deliver divine messages to people. The name angel comes from the Greek word for messenger and became associated with the mysterious figures because of what appears to be their principal function. But angels play many other roles as well, including that of warrior, guardian, and protector, heavenly counselor, winged mount, celestial guide, or escort, to name but a few. Angels play prominent roles in Christian and Islamic, as well as biblical Jewish, lore and spirituality. On the whole, they act as intermediaries between the realms of the divine and the human. Ancient Indian, especially Buddhist, tradition includes luminous beings called apsaras, though not depicted as winged. These lovely beings usually float through the air in scenes decorating Buddhist temples all over Asia. They often function as dancers and musicians.
What does the term historical critical method mean?
When Christians study their scriptures, they can take any of a number of approaches, as already suggested. A common pastoral approach nowadays reads the scriptures almost entirely as if they are addressed to 20th century Christians and are thus in a way timeless and not subject to historical conditions. Another approach tries to get behind the words as much as possible to understand their meaning in their original context. This second approach by no means disregards the personal, pastoral, and deeply spiritual implications of the sacred text. But it begins with the assumption that one cannot know those deeper meanings without first understanding how and why the inspired authors wrote as they did. Historical critical scholarship looks, for example, at the differences in how even texts, as generally concordant as the Synoptic Gospels, show divergences in vocabulary, major themes, order of events in the life of Jesus, and points of view tailored to different audiences. It notes how the inspired authors, as much editors as original writers, interwove Jesus' words and actions, telescoping time and space. As skilled literary communicators, the inspired writers also made use of stylized scenes that followed predictable patterns in their description of the main actors, actions, and crowd responses. Combining analyses of the literary, linguistic, and historical elements, the historical critical method seeks insight into how these documents, 2 millennia and many layers of culture removed from us, appear to speak in so many distinct voices about the same great spiritual reality. Underlying it all, the method suggests, are the unique theological insights granted to each of the sacred authors. Each offers a characteristic reflection on the deeper meaning of the good news and of Jesus the Christ. For Mark, Jesus was most of all the suffering servant; for Matthew, the Messiah; for Luke, the Savior whose ongoing presence is the Holy Spirit; and for John, the Divine Son. These are not exclusive, but complementary insights. Unlike the predominantly spiritualized or pastoral method of interpretation, whose immediate concern is to deal with apparent inconsistencies among the sacred authors by harmonizing them into a seamless reconstruction, the historical critical method seeks a unity of scriptural revelation through the uniqueness and diversity of the evidence.
Have deists traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Daoism generally has not been a mission-oriented tradition. There have been periods in the history of China during which deist authorities have made it clear that life would be more difficult for non-deists. A number of Chinese emperors espoused Daoism as the official state creed, in effect, and attempted to cleanse the realm of Buddhists. And there have been times when deists have been in serious competition with Confucians. But on the whole, systematic missionary activity is not the essential ingredient in Daoism that it has been in Islam, Buddhism, and Christianity. When Daoism and CCT have spread, they have done so largely as a result of migration of Chinese merchant families.
Who are some of the principal Shinto male deities, apart from those mentioned in the primal myth?
Hachiman, generally identified as the kami of war, is near the top of the pantheon. It is no surprise that he often appears in painting and sculpture as armed and dangerous. But some of the most famous images portray Hachiman as a meditating monk or a solicitous bodhisattva. Almost half of all officially listed Shinto shrines, some 50,000 or more, honor Hachiman. A curious grouping called the Seven Gods of Good Luck, Shishifu-kujin, brings together figures of mixed background. Daikoku, sometimes called Daikoku-ten, hails from India, mythologically speaking, and probably traveled to Japan with an early influential Buddhist founder named Sayako. Daikoku is associated with accomplishment of one's goals and with wealth. Stone statues show a jovial bruiser with a sack over one shoulder, sitting on bales of rice and wielding a mallet with which he grants wishes. Also a god of prosperity, Ebisu is popular especially in fishing villages, rice farms, and local marketplaces. Ebisu is deaf and fails to hear deities being called together for his own October celebration. Like Daikoku, Bishamon, also Bishamontan, is of Indian origin. In the Hindu pantheon he was one of the four heavenly guardians, presiding over the north. In Buddhist as well as Shinto iconography, Bishamon is heavily armed and holds a miniature pagoda in his left hand as a symbol of his authority. Fukuro Kuju, who originated in Daoism, stands for happiness, fortune, and long life, as his name indicates. When depicted in the arts, he looks very much like his Chinese counterpart. Xiao Lao, generally accompanied by a crane or deer. Like the next god of good luck, Jurajin. He also has a walking stick to which he has attached a sacred text. Jurajin is another patron of longevity of Daoist origin. Hodei, likewise drawn from the Daoist pantheon, stands for happiness and wealth. Benzaiten, also known as Benton, is the lone female of the bunch. The septet of good fortune kami have been a favorite subject. 4 popular and charming miniature carvings called netsuke. A large number of kami are associated with forces of nature. Fujin, kami of wind, carries a large bag, and his companion kami of thunder. The menacing red-faced Raijin, or Raiden, holds a massive drum. A generic group of minor deities called Dosujin protect travelers ever since Izanagi brought them into being upon his return from the underworld. A kami called Koshin is one protector of travelers, but some also identify him with farming. His 3 monkey partners have become popular as see no evil, hear no evil, do no evil. Kami keep watch over every conceivable feature of ordinary life. Sujin, a god of water, guards wells and other water sources. For water is the principal means of purification and an essential of life.
But what about conversion from one Christian group to another?
In those cases, practice concerning baptism varies. Some churches re-administer the ritual in the belief that the convert's former community was not authentically Christian. Others consider all Christian baptism valid and binding, since it is unnecessary to repeat the ceremony. They might substitute for it another religious ritual of welcome into the new community of believers.
How do Hindus use statues and other similar visual imagery in worship?
Sacred sculpture plays a central role in the overall symbolism of Hindu devotional ritual. Individual images, called vigraha, something one can grasp, of each of the major deities are generally of granite or marble, though some are made of other materials. Sculptors follow principles laid down in medieval texts that stipulate in detail the proportions and features essential for each deity. Some regard dark stone as the ideal medium because it suggests infinite power and mystery. Images are not themselves deities, but merely specific places in which the deity condescends to dwell for the benefit of devotees. When devotees lavish ritual attention on the images, they acknowledge the sacred symbolized there, rather than any power inherent in the material image. Each major temple image resides in a cave-like shrine called the womb chamber, Garbhagriha. That offers an essential clue to the metaphorical purpose of sacred sculpture. Images represent the dark mystery of divine fecundity from which all things emerge. Central to image-based ritual is the notion of darshan, seeing and being seen by the deity. In a manner analogous to Eastern Christian use of icons, Hindu practice interprets the eyes as the central visual symbol in the relationship between the devotee and the ultimate object of devotion. God sees the individual as surely as the devotee sees God. It is neither magic nor simple idolatry, but an acknowledgement of the fundamental human need to pray with all the senses. Images offer devotees something to hold on to, a way of understanding.
What gender-related issues have been important in Confucianism and CIT?
Confucian tradition emphasized social order, and that called for clearly delineated gender functions. Given the conviction that only a patriarchal structure could guarantee social order. What many people today call social equality was simply not included in the Confucian lexicon. Confucian teaching envisioned male-female relationships according to a political model. First and foremost among questions of gender are those relating to family structure and roles. But whether within the family or in society at large, women and younger people generally shared the expectation of dutiful obedience. Women remained in the home to serve the family, which sometimes brought as many as 4 generations together in one household. Widows were typically expected not to remarry. When a wife produced no son, a husband could marry one or more secondary wives in the hope of securing a male heir. A telling fact is that no women are numbered among the great sages and scholars memorialized in Confucius temples. In the imperial household, there were sometimes several empresses and many royal concubines. An empress remained out of view for the most part, participating in a few affairs of state annually. Eunuchs looked after the harem, strictly organizing the lives of all women in the imperial household.
What is the Eightfold Noble Path?
True to his hard-headed realism, the Buddha did not send his followers off on a wild goose chase. He suggested a method for achieving a balanced approach to everyday experience. Buddhists call his teaching the middle path because it aims at balance, propriety, and equanimity. Eat what you need and use whatever is necessary for a modest style of living. The 8 elements in the classical formulation of the standards for such a life are divided into 3 larger categories: wisdom, ethics, and concentration. Achieving wisdom requires proper belief in the form of deep understanding of the 4 noble truths, and proper intent, which means that one performs all acts out of compassion rather than out of selfish motives. The next 3 steps on the path involve ethics. Proper speech means avoiding all evils of the tongue. Proper action, expressed negatively, means refraining from inappropriate sexual relationships, killing, and stealing. And proper livelihood calls for the avoidance of occupations that cause harm, such as dealing in slavery or weapons. Training in concentration also has a triple foundation. Proper effort means perfect balance in one's attitude toward work. Proper attentiveness flows from deep reflection on the Four Noble Truths. And proper absorption, a lofty goal, means the ability to be genuinely content in equilibrium between pursuing goals and running from fears. Everything depends on carefully measured responses. That does not necessarily mean the death of spontaneity. It means a habit of discipline and keen awareness of one's personal motivations.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Shinto worship and prayer?
Shinto tradition refers to all of its ritual furniture and utensils with the term saikigo. It includes several items used on every altar during offering ceremonies. The priest carries the offerings, hihaku, and gifts of food, shinzen, on a tray, sambo, which he sets upon an 8-legged table, hasekuin, made of a special reddish cypress wood, hinoki, fire tree. Priestly staff remove these objects after worship ends. Objects used regularly in nearly all rituals include several items that ritual specialists wave over those to whom they are ministering. Branches of the sakeke, combining characters for tree and kami, provide a splash of greenery and association with living nature. A wand used for purification, either in place of or in conjunction with the sakeke branch, is called harigushi, a thick cluster of white paper streamers attached to a long stick. Another stick with a set of zigzag cut white, and sometimes of other colors. Paper symbolizes the kami's presence in the holy place. All 3 objects are mounted on stands and displayed when not in use by one of the priests or a miko. Miko also use a set of 5 bells, suzu, for their sacred dances. Several larger implements play a central role in the great public festivals called matsuri. Most important is the portable shrine called the mikoshi. Celebrants carry this miniature, but still often very heavy, 4-sided model of a shrine sanctuary in procession, shouldering long beams that hold the shrine aloft. Larger mikoshi can weigh up to several tons and require a large crew of strong bearers. In some places large wagons called yatai and dashi rumble through the streets on massive wheels, carrying groups of musicians and revelers. Built like mobile shrines, the hefty wooden wagons range in height from just over 30 feet to about 65 feet.
What are the 5 pillars of faith for Muslims?
Muslims practice adherence to the five pillars of faith. 1. Profession of belief in Allah as the only God and Muhammad as his prophet. 2. Ritual prayer 5 times daily at dawn, at noon, in the afternoon, in the evening, and at nightfall. 3. Giving alms to the poor. 4. Fasting from dawn until dusk during the holy month of Ramadan. And 5. Making the pilgrimage, Hajj, to the holy city of Mecca at least once during their lifetime.
Is there a system of deist religious law?
Apart from the charters or disciplinary codes of deist organizations such as monastic orders, there is no such thing as formal deist religious law. The very idea goes against the grain of the concept of natural balance and harmony that is so central to deist thought. That is not to say that there aren't countless standard practices and expectations as to behavior. The difference between Daoism and, say, Islam or Christianity, in this respect is that the Muslim and Christian traditions have systematically codified those expectations while the deist has not. Every cultural and religious system has its standards and sanctions. But in the cases of both Islam and Christianity, independent legal systems became necessary largely because the religious traditions expanded into new cultural settings very different from those in which the traditions arose. In the case of Daoism, religion and culture have been much more closely and consistently identified, making a separate system of religious law largely unnecessary.
Are number, color, or nature symbolism important in deist tradition and CCT?
Astrological calculation and cosmological imagery have long been an integral part of Chinese religious views. Hundreds of symbolic elements make up this vast system of correspondences. Zodiacal animals are associated with the 12 months. Each of the 4 quadrants of the universe has its 7 constellations in addition to its connection with specific trigrams, all related to particular aspects of good fortune or difficulty. Each of these elements is further coordinated with one of the 5 symbolic colors: black, white, red, green, yellow, and elements: wood, water, earth, metal, fire, and organs of the human body. Here are some examples of popular animal symbolism. The crow, surprisingly perhaps, symbolizes the sun. The crane, guide of the immortals, means long life, as do the dove and the hare. Fish are reminders of renewal of life and abundance. By association with plowing new fields, the ox means spring and vitality. The sharp-eyed, quick-tongued parrot looks after faithfulness in marriage. Flowers, trees, and fruits almost always have some symbolic resonance. The springtime peony means tenderness and womanly beauty, as does the jasmine. The plum means winter and reminds of Lao Zi, who was born beneath a plum tree. Bamboo betokens endurance, The Orange Benevolence. A complete listing would fill several books. Of course, not everyone thinks consciously of specific symbolic meanings upon seeing any of the hundreds of visual decorative motifs in the full catalogue. But most Chinese still grow up surrounded by countless symbolic associations of this kind.
What is meant by the term Chinese Community Traditions, CCT?
Much more ancient than religious or even earlier philosophical Daoism are the various currents of popular religious belief and practice that together comprise what will be referred to as Chinese Community Traditions or CCT. Historians of religion suggest that most Chinese who engage in public expression of religious beliefs actually belong to this broad popular stream. Many of their beliefs have Daoist connections, but, unlike Daoism as such, CCT has not been associated with formal religious institutions such as priesthood and monastic orders, and does not possess a scriptural canon. Many beliefs and practices now widespread in popular tradition also have roots in ancient Confucian and imperial cultic institutions, and in Buddhism as well. Countless CCT temples began to appear in towns and villages several centuries ago. Since they do not have their own resident ritual specialists, these temples often enlist the services of Daoist priests. But their day-to-day services are often handled by dedicated laypersons. Many such temples are associated with families who maintain them as a public service and a family tradition. Some elements of CCT also appear in temples ostensibly identified as Buddhist. A Guanyin temple in Honolulu, for example, combines Buddhist rituals with a host of other popular practices. Though the main image is that of the Buddha, numerous other icons are prominently displayed. That particular temple is run by a group of Chinese Buddhist nuns who are especially concerned with preserving the image that theirs is a purely Buddhist temple, in spite of the obvious diversity within it. Recently, when a visitor asked permission to snap a few photos inside, the nun in charge agreed. But whenever she thought his camera lens was wandering toward Confucius or another icon, she tugged his sleeve and waved a disapproving finger at him. Only Buddha, she insisted. Just a few blocks away, above a small upholstery shop, is the Lum family temple. There, all the deities are clearly of the CCT variety. Even though some are often inaccurately identified as Daoist.
What makes important religious practices rituals and ensures that they work?
In addition to the various primary ritual functions are a host of lesser or secondary ritual acts that help participants establish a proper ritual setting and ensure that the actions are maximally efficacious. The setting includes the space, time, and feeling that make a ritual work. Many rituals occur in spaces designated for that purpose. but in some instances separate preparatory rituals are used to mark the boundaries of a ritual space. They can include sub-rituals, such as processions or purification ceremonies. Other sub-rituals establish the boundaries of sacred time. Bell, drums, or calls to prayer may mark the opening and closing of a ritual. Still other rituals enhance a feeling or mood by appealing to the senses. The use of incense burners is an example of a widespread practice. Finally, some traditions assure continuity and purity of rituals with precise instructions on how they are performed. These instructions are often called rubrics. Because they are sometimes printed in red, Latin ruber, to mark them as directions.
What are some of the main themes in religious belief generally?
Statements of belief typically begin with basic statements defining the traditions. Supreme Being and the principal deeds of that being on behalf of the community of faith. Descriptions of deity and of other spiritual powers figure prominently in many traditions, often in the form of extended narratives that can be extremely elaborate and detailed. Believers in most traditions are taught the array of benefits they can expect from the Supreme Being if only they make appropriate petition. The ways believers ought to respond to the Supreme Being's actions are often paralleled by fundamental ethical considerations governing human relationships. Some traditions place great emphasis on the role of intermediaries or foundational figures, especially concerning their function of delivering a revelation to humankind. Those figures sometimes symbolize the whole history of the Supreme Being's dealings with his or her people. A major theme focuses on notions of the afterlife and on how to achieve the best of rewards and avoid the direst of punishments.
Is meditation important in Daoism or CCT?
Dominant forms of devotional expression in CCT tend to be associated with more extroverted ritual and supplicatory prayer. Classical and later Daoist sources, on the other hand, describe various meditative methods designed to help the practitioner turn inward. In fact, Chan Buddhism, the Chinese precursor to the more famous Japanese Zen, seems to have borrowed much from Daoism in this respect. The meditator sits and forgets in the presence of nature, engaging in the fast of the mind. Principal stages in Daoist meditative technique are the following. First, the meditator calms the body by adopting a fixed posture and slow, regular breathing. As the meditator becomes one with his or her breathing, distractions begin to dissolve. To develop greater concentration, the meditator chooses a specific symbolic focus for detailed visualization. In the next stage, the meditator moves beyond this discursive intellectualizing into the fast of the mind. Leaving behind all symbols and ideas, the meditator enters a realm where images are irrelevant. Finally, the meditator loses all sense of self and attains union with the Deo.
What is a sacred text or scripture?
All of the traditions surveyed in this book possess extensive sacred literatures. These sacred texts are commonly called scriptures, literally, writings. Some traditions revolve around a single scripture, a book composed over a relatively short period of time and perhaps associated with only a single human figure. Islam's Quran is such a text. Others have generated their sacred writings in stages lasting many centuries, resulting in scriptures that are more like anthologies of smaller books bound together in a single larger volume. The Hebrew Scriptures, what many Christians call the Old Testament, are an example. Still other traditions revolve around the equivalent of whole libraries of sacred texts that came into being over as much as 2 millennia, as in the case of the greater Hinduism's vast patrimony. In addition to the primary sacred texts, many traditions have large collections of secondary texts, still considered essential but of slightly lesser authority. Islam has its sayings of Muhammad, hadith, for example. In addition, the primary and secondary scriptures themselves often give rise to still further development of highly authoritative literature that takes the form of commentary on the scriptures. Rabbinical Judaism is enshrined in hundreds of volumes of this kind.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Muslim?
Muslim men and women sometimes wear items or styles of clothing that clearly set them apart from non-Muslims. Stop by the local mosque on Friday afternoon and you will invariably find men arriving for the congregational prayer wearing long flowing gowns and small knit or other fabric caps that cover most of the head. In honor of Muhammad's practice of covering his head during prayer. Men of Southern Asian origin, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, sometimes wear a kind of boat-shaped cap commonly worn back home. In some parts of the world, men who have made the Hajj signify their status as Hajis by wearing a burgundy fez wrapped in a white cloth. The rimless fez became popular because it was practical for use during prostration in prayer, allowing easy contact of the forehead with the ground. More than likely the women attending a mosque will be wearing some form of head covering and an ankle-length dress or tunic with slacks. In many instances the choice of distinctive garb is related to an individual's personal devotion and desire to symbolize his or her commitment to Islamic religious and social values. Most items of clothing are best understood as traditional rather than inherently religious, since they carry no explicit and uniquely Islamic symbolism. However, many Muslim women and men wear various items of jewelry bearing Islamic symbols. Most common are rings, pendants, and bracelets containing religious words or phrases in Arabic. Some show a star within a crescent moon. A symbol some interpret as a reference to the astronomical signs that mark the onset of the month of Ramadan. Favorite texts include the word Allah, phrases such as Insha'Allah, God willing. The Shahada, names of Muhammad and the four rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Muslim designers produce a wide range of religious adornment and market them through an increasing number of suppliers and boutiques that advertise in Muslim publications worldwide.
What signs or symbols distinguish Confucian and CIT ritual specialists?
Even today, leaders of Confucian rituals are typically also government officials. When they function as ritual specialists, they don the garments once worn by representatives of the imperial household and administration. As for CIT, since there is no longer any official imperial religious worship, there are no longer CIT ritual specialists. Prior to 1911, however, CIT ritualists, from the emperor on down to the humblest assistant, simply wore the garments that signified their respective bureaucratic ranks and offices. In this case, the literati did double duty as custodians of both civil and religious ritual. For especially important events, officials wore various garments known generically as dragon robes, each decorated with emblems of the wearer's administrative rank. Imperial robes worn by the ruler during rituals were once festooned with an array of symbolic decorative motifs known collectively as the 12 ornaments, or symbols. Symbolizing heaven and its wisdom were the sun, shown with a three-legged raven inside its red disk, the blue or green moon surrounding a hair grinding, the elixir of immortality with mortar and pestle, and the constellations. Images of mountains symbolized earth and strength. Standing for all living things, the dragon symbolized resilience. The pheasant, culture and literary accomplishment. In images of bronze ritual vessels, celebrants saw filial devotion. In cereal grains, abundant harvest, in flame illumination, and in the water plant purity. Along with the mountains, the latter four also corresponded with the 5 elements. Finally, the fu, a geometric form meaning good fortune, and the axe referred respectively to the imperial prerogatives of judgment and punishment. When displayed together, the 12 were done in combinations of the 5 symbolic colors associated with the 5 directions. None but the emperor's ritual vestments could depict all 12 ornaments, since they constituted a symbolic summary of the whole cosmos.
What is a jinn?
You've probably heard stories about the magical powers of genies who appear when someone rubs a magic lamp just right. The word genie comes from the Arabic word jinn, which refers to creatures of smokeless fire who inhabit a mysterious realm somewhere between the human and the divine. According to popular lore in Muhammad's time, the jinns would eavesdrop on the heavenly councils and offer to divulge their secrets to a soothsayer, called a kahin, pronounced kaahin, who uttered the proper formula. Some of Muhammad's early critics charged that he was not a prophet but just another Majnun, pronounced Majnoon, one possessed by a jinn. To call someone Majnun is to question the person's credibility as well as sanity. Countless jinns inhabit the world, some mischievous and some helpful and benevolent. King Solomon had the special gift of taming the jinn and enlisting them for the construction of his majestic temple. Particularly troublesome are the frighteningly ugly jinns called ghouls, from which we get the word ghoul. For those who do not know how to handle them, jinns can make life unpleasant, but their powers are limited.
How do Muslims view Islam's relationship to other traditions?
According to the Quran, the revelation delivered through Muhammad is not new, but a continuation and reaffirmation of the divine message given to all. The earlier prophets acknowledged in the Jewish and Christian traditions. If prior generations of Jews and Christians had not misinterpreted or even willfully corrupted the message, subsequent corrective revelations would have been unnecessary. In other words, Muslims regard Islam's relationship to the earlier Abrahamic faith somewhat the way Christians regard their tradition's relationship to Judaism. The later revelation completes, fulfills, corrects, or abrogates the earlier one. Islamic tradition regards the peoples of the book as especially close kin. The Quran suggests that Muslims should consider Christians perhaps somewhat closer than Jews. Even though there are far larger theological differences between Islam and Christianity than between Islam and Judaism. The concept of peoples of the book also came to include other minority religious communities of the Middle East, such as the Zoroastrians. In general, Muslims are inclined to regard members of other traditions, such as Hindus and Buddhists, for example, as considerably further removed from the possibility of salvation. But views of that sort naturally vary somewhat from region to region. As for example, in India, where Muslims and Hindus often live side by side.
What are the three bodies of the Buddha?
The concept of the three bodies, Trikaya, of the Buddha evolved as a way of explaining how the spiritual entity called the Buddha nature could transcend all earthly realities and at the same time manifest itself in the world. Pure Buddha nature existed in the Dharma body and was personified as the primal or universal Buddha, living in various heavenly abodes that made up the bliss body were the five principal meditational Buddhas. 1 ruling the center and 4 ruling the paradises at the 4 cardinal points. Transcendent Bodhisattvas assisted the celestial Buddhas in the work of salvation through grace. Involved in earthly affairs were the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who entered history in the manifestation body, subjecting themselves to time and change out of compassion for all suffering beings.
Is the term revelation useful in understanding Buddhist tradition?
Revelation, as a number of traditions use the term, presupposes that the ultimate truths remain beyond the grasp of human beings until the source or custodian of those truths chooses to make them available. By unveiling the mystery, the giver of truth entrusts the ultimate realities to humankind, often through a mediating figure such as a prophet. Buddhist tradition considers ultimate truths within reach of any person willing to pay attention. The truth is not, as some have always believed, out there. It is right in front of you and within yourself. But dealing consistently with that kind of in-your-face truth is difficult and demanding and often lonely. As a result, Buddhists over many centuries and in many places have developed their distinctive variations on the theme of revelation, with its suggestion of privileged access to hidden truths. Buddha told his followers to be lamps unto their own feet. But there have always been Buddhist teachers and preachers to remind people what the Buddha said. Buddha told his followers the truth was not wrapped in arcane mysteries, but there have always been special, sometimes very esoteric, teachings about the secret meanings of what the Buddha said. The major difference here between Buddhism and, say, the Abrahamic faiths is that the concept of prophetic revelation is at the heart of the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic worldviews.
Is it true that Muslims never depict human or animal figures?
Browse the pages of virtually any publication designed for Muslim readers and you may be surprised at the number of illustrations featuring human and animal figures. Shelves of mosque bookstores are filled with books, especially those designed for children, similarly illustrated. Still, the notion persists, among Muslims and non-Muslims alike, that Muslims don't do pictures. What most people popularly perceive as a blanket prohibition of images actually applies only to ritual settings. In other words, you will not find figural or representational imagery in a mosque. Islamic and Jewish tradition share the concern that inherent in representational visual imagery, especially of the three-dimensional sort, sculpture, is the risk of idolatry. Muslim artists throughout the ages and across the globe have produced a great deal of figural art, even including images of prophets and other holy persons. But their images are so clearly abstract and non-realistic that they can scarcely be taken as the artist's attempt to usurp God's creative power for purposes of education and entertainment. Two-dimensional images generally have been perfectly acceptable. In fact, even the prohibition on three-dimensional imagery is far from absolute. Except in the context of worship. For example, Muslim children play with dolls. Devout Muslims express a preference for educationally suitable imagery that exemplifies virtue and ethical values. Under the heading Move Over Barbie, one company markets a doll called Raisin. Dressed in white head and shoulder covering, the hijab, and green full-length gown, jilbab. The hijab is removable so that little girls can learn about donning the proper covering. Raisin's clothes are decoratively trimmed, but she wears no makeup.
What is jihad?
Jihad, pronounced Ghaad, comes from an Arabic verb that means to struggle or exert oneself. In recent years both Muslims and non-Muslims alike have bandied the term about so loosely that one has to do some digging to retrieve an accurate understanding of it. According to news reports, everyone from the scarcely devout Saddam Hussein to Osama bin Laden and the Taliban has called for a jihad against somebody, usually the West. Hence the virtually automatic translation of jihad as holy war, at best a misleading, and at worst a highly inflammatory, interpretation. Jihad does have a range of precisely defined meanings in Islamic tradition. Under prescribed circumstances, jihad can include offensive military action where the free practice of Islam is under threat of constraint. Many scholars in recent times have held that one cannot justify an offensive jihad unless Muslims are being persecuted religiously. Even then, therefore, we are talking about a type of defensive action. Military jihad has always been subject to strict criteria and is in many ways parallel to the Christian notion of just war. Very few, if any, recent calls for jihad have actually satisfied the necessary criteria. Muslims also speak of various nonviolent forms of jihad. One can battle injustice and evil through jihad of the pen or the tongue, for example. When someone asked Muhammad what the greatest jihad was, the Prophet replied that it was to speak a word of truth in the ear of a tyrant. An important theme in Islamic spirituality has been called the Greater Jihad. As distinct from all the various forms of exterior, lesser jihads. Warriors of the spirit must take up the sword of self-knowledge against the fiercest enemy of all, their own inner tendencies to evil and idolatry.
How do religious traditions settle on the contents of their scriptures?
Scripture-centered traditions sometimes take centuries to decide definitively the question of which important texts to include in the category of scripture and which to exclude. The overall process is called the formation of a canon. Sacred texts eventually proclaimed canonical carry considerably greater authority than those excluded from the scriptural canon. In some cases we know relatively little about the process itself. And in many instances we are not entirely certain when a given tradition fixed its canon. For the majority of the larger traditions, the process of canon formation seems to stretch across many generations. In the case of Islamic scripture, which developed over a fairly short time and is traditionally associated with only one person, the process appears at first to have been rather straightforward. But even there, recent scholarship has begun to uncover details that suggest a different picture.